My name is Jacob Fowler, and I wear two hats. I'm an ordinary homeowner who values peace and quiet, but I also happen to hold a position in the county zoning office, which gives me the final say on all building approvals in this jurisdiction. Talk about an awkward advantage, right? Before we dive in, comment below and let me know, where are you watching this from today? I want to see how far this story travels. All right, buckle up, because what started as a quiet confrontation quickly spiraled into something you won't believe. Lightning flashed across the sky as I slammed the car door shut, heart pounding at what I'd just discovered on my property. For weeks, I'd heard rumors that the HOA, a notoriously controlling homeowners association in my neighborhood, was up to something big. But never did I imagine they'd build massive horse stables on my very own land without my knowledge. The rain began pouring down in thick sheets, and the thunder echoed like distant drums announcing a battle none of us saw coming. Yet, as I stood there staring at the massive wooden beams and half-finished roofs, I felt an unexpected surge of determination. Someone had crossed the line, ignoring not just basic courtesy but also every zoning rule under the sun. They didn't know who they were messing with. After all, authority is a tricky thing. If you misuse it, it can come back to haunt you. I was more than ready to unleash my own powers. The next morning, I woke up to a string of urgent voicemails from neighbors who had driven by my property. Each message sounded more frantic than the last. It seemed the HOA was working around the clock, hauling in materials and manpower to complete these mysterious stables as fast as humanly possible. Why the rush? I figured they knew someone would eventually catch wind of their plan, and they wanted it finished before any official could shut it down. But they had no idea that the official in question was me. My gut told me to gather evidence first. So, armed with my phone's camera, I headed out to document every post, plank, and extraneous pile of lumber they had dumped on my lot. To my astonishment, the construction zone was colossal, sprawling across acres of what used to be open grassland. Horses were nowhere in sight yet, but fresh feed sacks sat in a corner, as though expecting new arrivals. My heart pounded with both anger and exhilaration. I'd never asked for a war with the HOA, but apparently they thought they could trample my rights without consequence. Well, in my position, I had the tools to push back hard. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed footprints that didn't match any shoe size I recognized. A chill ran down my spine, reminding me this was bigger than me alone. I intended to fight with every ounce of determination I possessed. The question was, how far would they go? I decided to pay a visit to the HOA president, Marjorie McKenna, a figure whose name alone made most people in our neighborhood tense up. She was the type to enforce rules against kids drawing chalk art on their driveways. So building unauthorized horse stables on private land felt wildly out of character, unless she was getting something significant in return. That morning, I composed an email requesting an urgent meeting. Within the hour, her assistant replied, saying Ms. McKenna could meet me at the community center that afternoon. When I arrived, the place was deserted except for a single receptionist who showed me to a small conference room. Waiting there was Marjorie herself, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, her eyes scanning me like a hawk. The tension was immediate and thick, both of us fully aware of the standoff about to unfold. I forced a polite smile, knowing I had leverage she couldn't possibly suspect. She gestured for me to sit. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, voice like a dagger wrapped in velvet. Leaning forward, I locked eyes with her and calmly replied, "You built something on my land without permission. Care to explain?" Her lips tightened, but she kept her composure, signaling this was going to be a clash of wills neither of us would walk away from easily. She folded her hands on the table and replied, "I think you might want to reconsider that accusation." Right then, I knew this was war. Marjorie's confidence surprised me, but it also made me wary. She wasn't flustered in the slightest, as though she'd prepared for this very conversation. Leaning back in my chair, I studied her posture. She offered a measured, almost smug smile, which set every nerve on edge. "Perhaps," she said, "you're mistaken about who owns that particular stretch of land." Her tone was poised, but her gaze told me she believed she had me cornered. I arched an eyebrow and pulled out a file containing the deed. "I'm quite aware of what I own," I replied, placing the document on the table between us. She took a cursory glance but showed no sign of backing down. Instead, she handed me a separate folder with the HOA's seal. "Look carefully," she said. Inside were pages of dense text detailing an easement agreement. I scanned the paragraphs and realized the HOA claimed it had rights to develop community enhancements on a portion of my property. But something was off. The legal descriptions didn't match the actual coordinates. Either she was trying to bluff, or there had been a serious administrative error that someone was exploiting. My pulse quickened. If this was a con, it was elaborate. "Let's assume for a moment that your documents are valid," I said, feigning cooperation. "You still built massive structures without going through zoning." She shrugged. "We were told it would be approved regardless." My jaw tightened. Clearly, she believed I was just another powerless resident, but she was wrong. In my mind, I flashed back to the day I first bought the property. It was a scorching summer afternoon, and the real estate agent had shown me a wide expanse of green fields, perfect for the small orchard I'd always dreamed of planting. There was never any mention of an easement, especially not one allowing something as large-scale as horse stables. That flashback reminded me why this land meant so much. My parents had always talked about retiring here, watching sunsets while sipping lemonade on the porch. They'd passed away before seeing that dream come to fruition, but I had carried it forward with pride. Standing in that community center, facing Marjorie's smug expression, I felt my parents' legacy was now under threat. Still, I couldn't let anger guide my actions. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and slipped her file into my briefcase. "I'll have to verify this with county records," I said. A flicker of annoyance passed over her face. Maybe she'd hoped I'd back down immediately. "You do that," she replied. "But I'd suggest you tread carefully. The HOA has many allies." Her words were a thinly veiled warning. I thanked her, turned on my heel, and left without another word, determined not to show any hint of intimidation. Outside, the humid air clung to my skin, intensifying my resolve. She might have an army of rule-obsessed allies, but I had the zoning office on my side, and I intended to use every legitimate means to protect what was mine. Back at my home office, I spread out the documents on my desk, comparing the deed I had with the folder Marjorie provided. The language in her paperwork was tricky, full of legalese that hinted at some kind of shared property use. Yet the more I read, the more glaring the discrepancies became. The coordinates in the HOA's file didn't match the official county plot lines. It was as though someone had taken an old boundary description and sloppily pasted it into a new context. If my hunch was correct, this was a deliberate attempt to justify their construction. Late into the night, I pored over satellite maps, surveyed historical data, and even found references to a minor boundary dispute from decades ago. Eventually, I confirmed my suspicion. The HOA's claim was invalid. Still, knowledge alone wasn't enough to stop them. I needed to take a strategic approach if I wanted to prevent those stables from being completed and force them to tear down what was already built. Reaching into a drawer, I pulled out the thick manual of zoning regulations. It was time to use the system they thought I couldn't wield effectively. My official role gave me oversight, but bureaucracy moved slowly. I needed an ally, someone who understood HOA politics but wasn't fully on Marjorie's side. That's when I remembered my old friend Claire Newton, a neighborhood resident who'd once been part of the HOA board but left after a major falling out. She might know where the HOA's real weaknesses lay. The next day, I arranged to meet Claire at a local coffee shop. We hadn't spoken much since she stepped down from the board, but I recalled her frustration with the HOA's power plays. When she arrived, her face looked drawn, as if she'd been carrying the weight of some secret for years. After we exchanged pleasantries, I described the stable's fiasco in detail. Her eyes widened, then clouded with concern. "I'm not surprised," she said, stirring her lat with an anxious hand. "Marjorie has always had big plans, but no one dared question her methods. The moment I did, I was practically exiled." Leaning forward, I explained how I'd uncovered inconsistencies in the easement paperwork. Claire nodded grimly. They've been using shady tactics for ages, pressuring homeowners, forging signatures, sometimes even pretending official endorsements from the city. But a lot of people either don't notice or don't want to fight. I felt a surge of both anger and hope. If Claire knew these things, she might help me blow the lid off this entire operation. "I need to bring this to the attention of the county," I said. "But first, I have to make sure everything is airtight. Can you help me gather more evidence?" Claire hesitated, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "If I do, there could be backlash. They might come after me legally or socially." I placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "I'll protect you. We have the law on our side." Slowly, she nodded, though her trembling fingers told me she was terrified. Claire agreed to give me access to some older HOA records she had saved on a personal flash drive before leaving. Later that evening, she dropped by my house with the small plastic device in hand, looking over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. I invited her in, and we booted up my laptop, scanning through folders of meeting minutes, emails, and financial statements. What we found made my stomach churn. In one document dated almost a year ago, Marjorie had outlined a proposal for community equestrian facilities that included references to mandatory membership fees and special assessments. In another email chain, board members discussed ways to expedite construction by bypassing the usual permit channels. Their justification? They claimed it was for the benefit of everyone, so typical procedures were unnecessary delays. The more I read, the clearer it became that this was a power move designed to generate revenue and prestige for the HOA leadership. A line item in the financial statements hinted at personal compensation for those involved in the project. Claire and I exchanged horrified looks. "This is bigger than just stables on my land," I murmured. "They're trying to reshape the entire neighborhood under their control." She nodded, her face pale. "It's all about money and influence. They can charge homeowners extra for using the horse facilities, and if it's on your land, they don't have to buy or lease property." My anger flared. I closed the laptop, breathed deeply, and made a promise to myself I would expose them all. With the evidence in hand, I began crafting a formal complaint to the county's legal department. I also planned to submit a zoning violation notice complete with photographic proof and references to the building codes they'd blatantly ignored. But as I worked on the paperwork, a chill settled over me. There was no telling how the HOA or Marjorie specifically might retaliate once they realized I was coming for them, fully armed with official authority. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind whirred with every possible scenario, from the HOA filing a countersuit to them mobilizing community members against me. At around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the sender, HOA Enforcement. The subject line read, "Immediate cease and desist." Opening it, I skimmed a letter accusing me of trespassing on so-called HOA land and defamation of their board. They demanded I stop all interference. I stared at the screen, adrenaline surging. The letter was baseless, but it signaled their readiness to fight dirty. A wave of doubt washed over me. Could I handle a prolonged legal battle? Would the county back me up, or would bureaucracy slow the process until the stables were completed anyway? Sitting in the dark, the only light coming from my computer screen, I reminded myself why I was doing this: my parents' legacy, my rights as a property owner, and the integrity of the zoning laws I was sworn to uphold. Resolute, I clicked reply. In my response, I firmly stated that any claim of trespassing was invalid, as the land was indisputably listed under my name in county records. I also noted that defamation required proof of falsehood, which they clearly couldn't provide. I CC'd the county's legal department and attached the relevant documents, making sure everything was above board. Hitting send felt like releasing a built-up tension in my chest, but I knew this was only the beginning. The following day, I took a personal day off work to focus on my own legal strategy. I visited the county records office, requesting certified copies of my land deed and every associated easement file. The clerk, an elderly gentleman named Harold, recognized my last name. "Weren't your folks the Fowlers who used to volunteer at the community garden?" he asked kindly. Hearing that memory brought a small smile to my lips. "Yes, they were," he patted my hand. "They were good people. Let me see what I can find for you." By late afternoon, Harold had gathered a mountain of paperwork that confirmed my suspicions. The HOA's alleged easement was nowhere to be found in official records. They'd never filed the documents legally. Before I left, Harold gave me a concerned look. "Be careful. Sometimes these HOAs can be ruthless. I've seen folks get into real messes." I thanked him, swallowing the lump of anxiety in my throat. The more undeniable proof I collected, the more I feared what Marjorie might do next. Back in my office, I double-checked every citation in the zoning violation notice I planned to serve on the HOA. With the official deed in hand, I had all the evidence required to halt construction immediately. Next step was to deliver it through proper channels, ensuring it would stick. However, a voice in my head nagged me to tread carefully. A direct confrontation could spark a bigger fight, potentially turning my neighbors against me if the HOA spun the narrative. That evening, Claire called. She'd heard rumors that Marjorie was already rallying support, claiming I was standing in the way of exciting new amenities. Claire warned me that the HOA might stage a community meeting to publicly shame me or frame me as the antagonist. Part of me bristled at the idea. How could anyone think I was the villain for defending my own property? But it was all too easy for facts to get twisted, especially in a tight-knit neighborhood craving something novel like horse stables. Determined, I finished drafting the notice and set it aside for courier delivery the next morning. Then I messaged Claire, asking if she could keep an ear out for any HOA activities or gatherings. She agreed, sounding more confident now that we had a solid plan. We were both aware we'd crossed a line of no return. The HOA had shown its fangs. It was time for me to reveal the legal sword I'd been sharpening. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. As dawn broke, I received a text from Claire. HOA emergency meeting tonight at 7 p.m. Community Center. Spread the word. My stomach flipped, a mix of nerves and excitement. This could be the perfect chance to present the truth. But it also meant walking into the lion's den where Marjorie would have home court advantage. I finalized a zoning violation notice, arranged for an official server to deliver it to the HOA office, and spent the rest of the day practicing what I'd say at the meeting. By 6:30, I was pacing in my living room, wrestling with the weight of what I was about to do. My phone dinged. It was the process server, confirming the notice had been successfully delivered. Good. Now the HOA couldn't claim ignorance of the legal ramifications. I arrived at the community center 10 minutes before 7, my heart pounding. The parking lot was unusually full, and inside the fluorescent lit hall buzzed with chatter. Around 50 residents, some curious, others visibly tense, sat on folding chairs arranged in rows. At the front stood a podium flanked by the HOA board members, Marjorie in the center. She wore an expression of righteous indignation that sent a ripple of apprehension through the room. Spotting me near the back, she gave a cold, knowing smile. Clearly, she intended to make a spectacle of this. Taking a seat beside Claire, I whispered, "This is it." She nodded, swallowing hard. We both understood that tonight's outcome could change everything. Marjorie called the meeting to order with a curt rap on the podium. She launched into a speech about the progressive vision of the HOA, praising the new horse stables as a facility that would elevate property values and unite the community. Her voice dripped with confidence, and I could sense the crowd's intrigue. Then she pivoted abruptly, casting me in a harsh light. "Unfortunately," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me, "we have encountered an obstacle. A homeowner is challenging the construction using questionable claims about land ownership." A murmur spread through the audience. I stood stepping into the narrow aisle and asked to address the assembly. Marjorie hesitated. This was her show. After all but the crowd's curiosity forced her to concede. Walking toward the front, I could feel every gaze on me. I cleared my throat, my voice trembling at first. "My name is Jacob Fowler, and I'm the legal owner of the land on which these stables are being built," I began. "I also work in the county zoning office. Contrary to what you may have heard, no legitimate easement exists allowing this structure." At that, Marjorie cut in, waving a folder that presumably contained the fabricated easement papers. "We have documentation," she retorted. I lifted my own folder, "and here are certified deeds and county records disproving your claim. Additionally, I've served a zoning violation notice." The crowd gasped. Marjorie's face hardened, but I pressed on, determined to shine a light on the truth. A tense silence followed my statement. People shifted in their seats, whispering and exchanging uncertain glances. Marjorie attempted to recover, flipping through her folder with exaggerated composure. "You're misunderstanding the situation," she declared. "These stables are meant to benefit everyone. Why would we need to jump through unnecessary hoops?" Her tone dripped with condescension, implying I was some obstructionist. Rather than argue, I calmly laid out the facts, pointing to specific references in the county code. "If you want to build on private land, you need permission from the owner or a valid easement, which you do not possess. And even then, you must file the appropriate paperwork for zoning approval, which you also failed to do." I paused, turning to address the audience more directly. "I understand the appeal of having horse stables here. But should the HOA really be allowed to trample over basic property rights and legal processes?" A few heads nodded in agreement. Others looked unsettled, torn between their desire for new amenities and the ethical dilemma now presented. Marjorie's face was flushed with anger. She pointed a finger at me. "You're just trying to keep these benefits from the community," she snapped, her voice shaking. Before I could reply, Claire stood up. All eyes turned to her. "That's enough," she said, her voice quivering yet resolute. "I used to be on this board. I saw how corners were cut, how false promises were made. Jacob is telling the truth. We have the records to prove it." The room fell utterly still. Claire's revelation sent a jolt through the crowd. People began murmuring among themselves. Marjorie looked like she'd been slapped, her eyes burned with betrayal. "So you're conspiring with him?" She spat, voice taut with outrage. Claire's gaze flicked my way, then back at Marjorie. "I'm not conspiring, I'm correcting a wrong," she said, lifting her chin. "When I resigned from the board, it was because I saw the direction things were headed. Secret deals, unjust fees, and now this. Building on private property without consent." Tension crackled in the air. Several community members asked to see the files Claire and I had. Others pressed Marjorie for an explanation. She stammered, grasping for words, her usual poise unraveling under the collective scrutiny. Seizing the moment, I turned to the crowd. "Look, I'm not against development or community projects. I'm against underhanded tactics. This construction was done illegally. If the HOA had come to me with a fair proposal, maybe we could have worked something out. But they didn't. They just built, assuming they wouldn't be challenged." A man in the front row stood and asked pointedly, "Marjorie, is it true you never filed for the proper permits?" Flustered, she muttered something about bureaucracy being too slow. Another person chimed in, "What about the extra fees you were going to charge us? Where's that money going?" The crowd's frustration was boiling over. Marjorie clutched the podium, struggling to keep control, but the tide had turned. I could almost see the fortress of intimidation she'd constructed starting to crumble. Sensing her grip slipping, Marjorie tried a new tactic: deflection. She announced that the meeting was adjourned, claiming she needed to consult legal counsel. But the residents weren't having it. A wave of chatter rose as people demanded answers. Over the din, I raised my voice. "There's a formal complaint filed. Expect an investigation." With that, Marjorie stormed out, followed by a few loyal board members, leaving the rest of us in a swirl of confusion and budding outrage. Some neighbors approached Claire and me, asking for details. Many expressed shock and disappointment in the HOA's shady actions. A few offered support, while others seemed worried about the fallout. After fielding a barrage of questions, Claire and I finally stepped outside. The sun had set, leaving the parking lot illuminated by weak streetlights. "That went better than I expected," Claire said, letting out a shaky breath. I nodded, though my heart was still pounding. We had made our case publicly, but Marjorie was bound to retaliate. "If she's calling her lawyer, we can expect legal pushback," I said. Claire frowned. "We have proof. But will the county actually step in fast enough? You know how slow these processes can be." I glanced back at the community center, lights glowing behind the windows. "We'll find out soon. Either way, I'm not backing down." We parted ways, each of us aware that the night's confrontation was just the first salvo. The real test of wills and evidence would soon unfold in a more official arena. Early the next morning, I received an urgent email from a colleague in the zoning office. It seemed word of last night's meeting had traveled fast. My colleague warned me that Marjorie had already lodged a counter-complaint, accusing me of abusing my position to advance a personal agenda. My stomach lurched. While I'd done everything by the book, even the perception of conflict of interest could muddy the waters. I immediately drafted a response, attaching all the documentation proving the HOA's non-compliance. Nonetheless, I couldn't shake the worry that this might spiral into a full-blown political battle. At the office, I met with my supervisor, Mr. Eldridge, a man known for his meticulous adherence to protocol. He asked me to lay everything out. After reviewing the evidence, he tapped his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "Jacob, you've clearly been wronged here, and the HOA has broken multiple regulations. But we must handle this with absolute transparency. We'll open a formal investigation separate from you to remove any appearance of bias." Part of me was relieved that they were taking it seriously. Another part worried about whether I'd be sidelined. Still, I agreed. Maintaining integrity was crucial. If the county found the HOA at fault, the stables would be halted, possibly demolished. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and stared at my phone. My voicemail icon blinked, several missed calls, presumably from anxious neighbors, or maybe even Marjorie's camp. Taking a deep breath, I prepared for whatever storm was brewing next. When I got home that evening, I found a letter taped to my front door. Inside a plain envelope was a note that read, "Stop digging or face consequences." My pulse raced. Someone had decided intimidation was their next move. That night, I called Claire to warn her. She sounded shaken but thanked me for the heads up. Determined not to let fear dictate my actions, I photographed the note and called the local sheriff's department, filing a report for harassment. The deputy who showed up was sympathetic but admitted such threats were tricky to trace. "Just keep your eyes open," he advised. Exhaustion weighed on me, but I had to press forward. The county investigation had officially begun, and a stop work order was about to be issued for the stables. If the HOA ignored it, they could face hefty fines and possible legal repercussions. My phone buzzed around 10 that night. It was an email from a neighbor, an older man named Tom, who'd never been particularly outspoken. He explained that he'd witnessed HOA trucks unloading materials at odd hours, and he had camera footage that might help. This was the kind of corroboration I needed, neighbors coming forward with evidence of their own. My tired mind found a small spark of hope. Not everyone in the neighborhood was blindly following the HOA. Some, like Tom, were willing to step up. With a few clicks, he shared the footage, and I saved it to a secure drive. As I watched the time-stamped videos, my resolve solidified. The next morning, the county officially posted a bright orange stop work notice on the stables. By afternoon, pictures of that notice were circulating on the neighborhood's social media page, igniting a flurry of heated comments. Some residents were outraged at the HOA for proceeding illegally, while others blamed me for obstructing what they believed to be a grand improvement. In the midst of the digital clamor, Marjorie broke her silence with a lengthy post, painting herself and the board as victims of bureaucratic red tape and a vindictive official. Yet she conveniently omitted the fact that I was the property owner. People began asking pointed questions, forcing her to confront the actual ownership dispute. The more she tried to spin the narrative, the more tangled it became. Behind the scenes, I and a few allies compiled a thorough report, complete with statements from neighbors like Tom, Claire's old board documents, and the official land records. Our goal was to submit an airtight case that would make it impossible for the HOA to claim ignorance or compliance. But every step forward brought new waves of hostility. Anonymous texts, letters in my mailbox complaining I was ruining the neighborhood, and even scowls from people who passed me on the street. It was draining, to say the least. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table sifting through the latest messages, I tried to remind myself that doing the right thing often came at a cost. The question was whether I was willing to pay it. Legal battles seldom unfold quickly, but the county's investigation moved faster than expected, likely due to the overwhelming evidence. Within a week, the zoning committee scheduled a public hearing to address the complaint. Notices went out to all residents, and anticipation ran high. This was shaping up to be a pivotal moment, not just for me, but for the entire community. When the day arrived, the hearing room was packed. I sat at a long table with my supervisor, Mr. Eldridge, and the county's legal counsel. Opposite us were Marjorie and two other HOA board members, along with a sharp-suited attorney who exuded confidence. The hearing officer, a stern woman named Ms. Ramirez, introduced the case. She invited the HOA to present its defense first. Their attorney claimed that miscommunication and outdated property maps led to an unintentional encroachment. He insisted they had no malicious intent, calling it a mere oversight. Marjorie tried to appear repentant, but her stiff posture betrayed her frustration. Then came my turn. I detailed how the stables were erected without my permission and highlighted the fabricated easement documents. Mr. Eldridge submitted the official records showing no valid easement existed. He also produced photos of the ongoing construction despite the lack of permits. By the time we finished, a hush fell over the room. Ms. Ramirez asked pointed questions, her gaze drilling into the HOA's attorney. Was any attempt made to secure the proper zoning approvals? The attorney hemmed and hawed, only fueling the impression that they'd been caught. During a recess in the proceedings, Claire approached me, her eyes shining with a mix of anxiety and encouragement. "You're doing well," she whispered, handing me a small bottle of water. I was grateful for the support. Meanwhile, Marjorie paced in a corner, clearly agitated by how the hearing was unfolding. Her attorney tried to calm her, but she shook him off. The moment we reconvened, Ms. Ramirez called for final statements. Marjorie stood, clearing her throat. "We deeply regret any confusion," she began, adopting a contrite tone. "Our intention was always to enhance the community." Though her words sounded remorseful, her eyes never met mine. My final statement was brief. I only ask that the law be upheld. My property rights have been ignored, and the zoning process has been subverted. If we allow this, what precedent does that set? Ms. Ramirez nodded solemnly before closing the hearing. She explained she'd review the evidence and issue a recommendation to the county commissioners within a few days. People filed out slowly, hushed discussions echoing against the marble walls. Marjorie and her attorney hurried away without a glance in my direction. I exhaled, feeling both relief and exhaustion. Claire patted my shoulder. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "Now it's in the county's hands." Part of me felt anxious surrendering control, but another part felt immense relief. The truth was laid bare. All we could do now was wait for the official verdict and brace for whatever came next. Days later, a letter arrived from Ms. Ramirez's office. With shaky fingers, I opened it to find her formal recommendation. The stables were in blatant violation of zoning laws, the HOA had overstepped its authority, and the county was well within its rights to demand immediate cessation of construction and the dismantling of any existing structures. Further penalties could be pursued if the HOA didn't comply promptly. My chest flooded with relief. Claire called moments after I read the letter, her excitement bubbling through the phone. "It's finally over," she exclaimed. But was it really over? I couldn't forget Marjorie's capacity for retaliation. That evening, Mr. Eldridge phoned, congratulating me on the outcome. He also mentioned the commissioners would likely hold a final vote to officially endorse Mrs. Ramirez's recommendation, which should be a mere formality given the evidence. Despite the good news, I noticed a few subtle changes around the neighborhood. Some neighbors who'd once given me dirty looks offered tentative smiles or nods, as if realizing they'd sided with the wrong party. Others avoided eye contact altogether, perhaps embarrassed or still resentful. The stables themselves stood silent. Construction halted, with stacks of lumber and tools left idly on my property. A fence had been partially erected, but no workers returned to finish the job. One or two nights, I thought I saw headlights near the site, possibly someone coming to remove equipment under cover of darkness. But I never caught a clear glimpse. The tension lingered, though the official verdict was in my favor. The day of the commissioners' vote arrived. Held in a formal chamber at the county building, it was open to the public, but far less crowded than the earlier hearing. Marjorie and a handful of HOA loyalists showed up, hoping for a last-minute miracle. However, their attorney was conspicuously absent. The commissioners took their seats, called the session to order, and without much fanfare, unanimously adopted Ms. Ramirez's recommendation. The final ruling mandated that the HOA remove all unauthorized structures from my land within 30 days and face a substantial fine for each day they failed to comply. Marjorie's face was pale. She listened in silence as the commissioners detailed the penalties. Once the vote was concluded, she approached me with tight lips. "You've just set this neighborhood back years," she snapped, eyes brimming with anger. My pulse quickened. Part of me wanted to lash out, to list all the ways she'd wronged me and the community. Instead, I kept my tone calm. "I'm enforcing my rights. If you'd approached me honestly, maybe we could have worked together." She scoffed and turned away. I watched as she hastily left the chamber, an air of defeat cloaking her usual bravado. Stepping outside, I took a deep breath, letting the sunshine warm my face. Claire joined me, hugging me in a quick burst of excitement. "You did it," she said. "So did you," I replied gratefully. Yet beneath our relief, I sensed the aftermath wouldn't be entirely smooth. Vindictive people rarely admit defeat graciously. Within a week of the commissioner's ruling, a demolition crew arrived to take down the partially built stables. I watched from my porch as heavy machinery rumbled onto my land, this time with proper permission, albeit for dismantling rather than constructing. A strange mix of triumph and sadness washed over me. On one hand, I was finally reclaiming my property. On the other, the land looked scarred by the remains of a venture that had stirred so much tension and hostility. Neighbors drove by slowly, some rolling down windows to shout words of support, others merely gawking. A few approached me on foot, offering apologies for not speaking up sooner. Apparently, the HOA's intimidation tactics had been more widespread than I realized. I accepted their gestures politely, relieved to see the community beginning to heal. Marjorie, meanwhile, was nowhere in sight. According to whispers, she planned to resign as president before the next board election. Rumor had it she was consulting lawyers about the mounting fines. Part of me almost felt sorry for her, but I couldn't ignore how she'd tried to bully everyone for personal gain. On the final day of demolition, I roamed the property line, imagining what it might look like once restored. Maybe I'd finally plant that orchard I'd dreamed of. The experience had been grueling, but it had reignited my passion for preserving what my parents left me. Despite the strain, I was determined to build something that honored their memory, free from underhanded schemes. After the stables were gone, the HOA board issued a public letter of apology, no doubt orchestrated by their legal team to mitigate further lawsuits. In it, they acknowledged misjudgments and promised to respect homeowners' rights going forward. Curiously, Marjorie's name appeared nowhere in the letter. A special election was announced to fill the soon-to-be vacant presidency. For the first time in years, people seemed energized about attending HOA meetings, determined not to let another person amass unchecked power. Claire confided in me that some neighbors had encouraged her to run for a board position. She was on the fence, not wanting to relive the nightmares of internal politics. Still, I saw a spark in her eye that hinted she might accept the challenge if it meant keeping the HOA honest. On my end, I found myself reflecting on the entire saga. So much conflict, stress, and fear, all rooted in a simple principle: property rights. Yet it also revealed how one person's misuse of power could ripple through a community. It reminded me of the significance of transparency, honesty, and the rule of law. I felt a renewed sense of duty in my zoning role to ensure that no one else would have to endure a similar ordeal. One evening, as the sun set over my now cleared fields, I stood with Claire, looking at the horizon. "You could still build something nice here," she said softly. I nodded, imagining rows of apple trees. My parents' vision was closer than ever, and no one was going to take that away. Several weeks later, life found a new normal. The once tense atmosphere in the neighborhood had begun to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. Marjorie was officially gone from the HOA, and a more transparent leadership began addressing the community's concerns. While fences took time to mend, people seemed open to forging healthier relationships. Standing on my porch one afternoon, gazing at the land that had been a battlefield, I realized this entire ordeal had changed me. I was no longer content to let authority figures operate unchecked, not just in my own life but in the community as a whole. The power we hold, whether in zoning offices or HOA boards, carries responsibility. Abuse of that power can tear people apart. It can destroy trust, dreams, and even livelihoods. Yet standing firm, guided by truth, can restore not only your own rights but also a sense of collective integrity. That, I believe, is the real lesson. As for the orchard, I've already started planting the first saplings, each one a testament to perseverance and justice. There's something deeply satisfying about cultivating life on land once threatened by someone else's ambition. In time, these trees will bear fruit, a reminder that we can rebuild even after the fiercest storms. And so, if you take anything away from my story, let it be this: never surrender what's rightfully yours. Stand firm, gather facts, and fight with integrity. In the end, you might just find that adversity can become the fertile ground for future growth, and that's a harvest worth waiting for.